Welcome back to Domain 5 of the Security Plus Exam Cram Series 2024 edition. Here in Section 5.2, we'll explore the risk management process. Now we'll start with identifying and assessing risks, but this is really just a warm-up. From here, we'll venture into the deep waters of risk analysis, where we'll explore quantitative risk analysis formulas. Intimidating, but I've got you covered. We'll also talk through risk management strategies, sometimes called responses to risk, and we'll wrap up with a discussion of business impact analysis. These are all topics you'll see on another exam that's anything but entry level, the CISSP. Heavy stuff, let's dig in. Welcome back to Domain 5 of the Security Plus Exam Cram Series 2024 edition. And here in Section 5.2, our focus will be risk management. And more specifically, the syllabus asks us to explain the elements of the risk management process. And I'll tell you, in this module, I see a massive amount of overlap with the CISSP exam, a security leadership exam. So we're going to touch on risk identification, risk assessment. We will dive into risk analysis and specifically into quantitative risk analysis and the related risk analysis formulas. We'll talk about a risk register, risk tolerance, risk appetite, risk management strategies, also known as responses to risk. We'll take a look at risk reporting techniques, and we'll wrap with business impact analysis. As someone who's taken the CISSP exam and created content here on YouTube for the CISSP, I can tell you from experience, every topic I see here is on that exam, and there are a few that are not. Many people think of the Security Plus exam as entry level. I'm telling you, the knowledge you're acquiring here is anything but. This is going to be great real-world knowledge for you and a big head start on another very popular security certification. So we're going to get into a couple of important terms, just starting right at the top of our syllabus. All important risk management concepts you should be familiar with for the exam. We'll start with risk identification, exactly what it sounds like. The process of identifying threats and vulnerabilities that exist in an operating environment, which can come from a variety of sources. This can include cyber threats, system failures, where we don't have good resiliency built into systems and services, and disasters, both natural and man-made. Risk assessment is the broader process of identifying, analyzing, evaluating, and prioritizing potential risks. Risk assessment really encompasses the broader process, from the initial identification of the risks all the way through developing mitigation strategies, which would include risk analysis. Now, risk assessment is not a one-time strategy. It's not a one-time event. There are multiple types of risk assessment we can use to identify, analyze, and prioritize our potential risks. There's the ad hoc risk assessment, which is an informal one-time assessment conducted in response to a specific event or concern. These are often conducted on an as-needed basis when we see a change in the environment introduced by a project or an implementation. When we have a new application or service or system come into the environment that changes our risk profile, we need to assess on an as-needed ad hoc basis. We have recurring assessments. These are conducted periodically at predetermined intervals, annually, quarterly. This is just part of the ongoing monitoring to track the evolution of risks over time in our environment. Then we have one-time risk assessment, which is a more formal version of one-time assessment as compared to ad hoc. It's usually in response to a security incident or a request from management, maybe brought on by a change in business strategy where management says, hey, we need to go back and reassess based on our new risk appetite. There's continuous risk assessment, which is an ongoing process where risk identification and analysis are integrated into daily operations. These are often automated, like recurring system scans. We're about to dive into risk analysis, but I want to quickly pause and make sure that we're clear on the difference between risk assessment and risk analysis. So just a quick level set. So we'll just look at the two side by side here. So in terms of scope, Risk assessment is the broader process encompassing risk identification, analysis, evaluation, and mitigation. And risk analysis is a specific step within risk assessment focused on analyzing the risks we've identified. Assessment is identifying, analyzing, prioritizing, and mitigating, where risk analysis is evaluating likelihood and impact of identified risks. So it's that step within the process. So in terms of focus, risk assessment is the high-level life cycle. Risk analysis is down in the weeds in the detailed examination of risk characteristics. In fact, we see it right here. It is the analyzing step in assessment. Now we're going to step into risk analysis. So there are two ways to evaluate risk to assets. There's qualitative risk analysis and quantitative risk analysis. Quantitative assigns a dollar value to evaluate effectiveness of countermeasures. That dollar value is the key. It is objective. It uses formulas. So on the quantitative side, sometimes to prioritize, we'll see an initial calculation using an impact times probability score, but that just gives us a rough cut on priority so we can then follow up with our formulas and really assess effectiveness of countermeasures, the impact, the probability, etc. Now, on the qualitative side, we use a scoring system to rank threats and effectiveness of countermeasures. It's a very subjective system. Qualitative risk analysis often uses low, medium, high, or a number scale, but we're not getting down to true numeric probability, impact, and cost effectiveness of the countermeasures. So qualitative is easier, faster, and less accurate. So if I were to summarize it, just put it simply, quantitative measurements use numbers like asset values and the cost of our security controls. Qualitative measures use judgments. And both methods aim to help management make educated risk decisions based on priorities. And the fact of the matter is, not every risk can be easily calculated through quantitative methods. How do I put a dollar value on the loss of my customer's trust? How do I put a precise value on reputational damage? I'm about to take you through the quantitative risk formulas. But before I do, I want to just mention an important note that you'll find on quantitative risk formulas in the official study guide, where it mentions you should be prepared to explain the terminology of quantitative risk analysis and perform these calculations when you take the Security Plus exam. That means you need to know the quantitative risk analysis formulas. Generally speaking, I would say this was not true with the SY0-601 exam, so this represents a bit of a shift, but I've got you covered. So we're going to start with some important terminology, some terms you'll want to be familiar with before we get to the formulas. So we'll start with impact, which is the potential consequence or negative effect that occur if a risk materializes. Asset value is the monetary value of the asset for which we're making calculations. And safeguard evaluation answers the question, is this safeguard cost effective? Because the bottom line is, organizations will not spend more than an asset's value to protect the asset. At that point, they could simply save their money, earn interest, and then pay to replace that asset should a risk be realized. So let's look at the formulas we'll be dealing with. And when it comes to quantifying potential loss, these four should be top of mind. Exposure factor, single loss expectancy, annualized rate of occurrence, and annualized loss expectancy. So we'll run right down the list, starting with exposure factor, which is the percentage of loss that an organization would experience if a specific asset were violated by a realized risk. For example, if I expected a $30,000 loss on a $100,000 asset every time a risk was realized, that would be an exposure factor of 30%. Next, we have single loss expectancy, which represents the cost associated with a single realized risk against a specific asset. The formula for single loss expectancy is the value of my asset times the exposure factor. So if we take that exposure factor example I gave you, an exposure factor of 30% on a $100,000 valuation, means we have a single loss expectancy of $30,000. So if I state it as a formula, asset value of $100,000 times the exposure factor, 30% represented as a decimal, equals a single loss expectancy of $30,000. Next, we have the annualized rate of occurrence, or ARO. This is the expected frequency with which a specific threat or risk will occur within a single year. So within a single year is key. So, for example, a risk occurs 2 times in a year. 2 occurrences divided by 1 year equals 2. That's our annualized rate of occurrence, twice a year. A risk occurs once every 2 years. 1 occurrence divided by 2 years equals 0.5. Risk occurs once every 5 years. 1 occurrence divided by 5 years equals 0.2. And I'll warn you on the exam, watch for annualized rate of occurrence. That is less than once per year because you're going to have that fractional ARO. That's something I expect they might try to use to trip you up. Next, we have the annualized loss expectancy. So this is the possible yearly cost of all instances of a specific realized threat against a specific asset. So if a risk is realized 5 times a year, what is that yearly cost? If the risk is realized once every 5 years, we average that cost out over 5 years. So let's look at an example. So our formula is pretty simple. It's the single loss expectancy times the annualized rate of occurrence. And here's an example. We have an office building that's worth $200,000. Our office is on the Gulf Coast of Texas. So if a hurricane hits us, estimated damage is 50%. Hurricane probability is 1 every 10 years, so a 10% chance. So we'll start by calculating our single loss expectancy. So we have a $200,000 asset. Damage is 50%. That's an exposure factor of 50% or 0.5. That means our single event total, our single loss expectancy, is $100,000. However, we say that a hurricane only occurs with a 10% probability once every 10 years. So let's calculate our annualized loss expectancy. We take that single loss expectancy of 100,000 times that 10% chance, that 10% annualized rate of occurrence, which gives us an annualized loss expectancy of $10,000 a year. So $10,000 is the magic number there. That is the value of a safeguard on an annual basis, the maximum value. So if I could insure my office building for less than $10,000 a year, that is going to be break even or better. If the insurance company said, you're on the Gulf Coast, we're going to charge you $15,000 a year for this insurance, well, it would be less expensive to just keep the money and pay for the damage when it actually occurs. Now, certainly I'm taking a risk there, because what if a hurricane happens more than once every 10 years? But on the other hand, what if it happens less than once every 10 years? So just to recap some terms and formulas here. We have the exposure factor, which is the percentage of the value of an asset lost due to an incident. Single loss expectancy, how much would it cost you if it happened just one time? And remember, the single loss expectancy formula is the asset value times the exposure factor. Annualized rate of occurrence, how many times does it happen in 1 year? Remember to watch for annualized rates of occurrence where it occurs less than once a year, so the rate of occurrence is longer than a year, because you're going to have a fractional ARO. Remember, 1 occurrence every 5 years is 1 divided by 5, or 0.2. I think that's an area where you could get tripped up. Annualized loss expectancy, how much will you lose per year? So for the annualized loss expectancy, that's single loss expectancy times the annualized rate of occurrence. Or if you wanted to state it another way, the asset value times the exposure factor, which equals the single loss expectancy, times the annualized rate of occurrence. Then last but not least, we have annualized rate of occurrence, which answers the question, how many times is the risk realized in 1 year. So remember to watch for annualized rate of occurrence longer than 1 year, which will be represented as a fraction. So 1 occurrence every 5 years, 1 divided by 5 equals an ARO of 0.2. Right, and that's what I have for you on the risk formulas. Do remember the official study guide suggests these formulas may come up on the Security Plus exam. I understand this is a lot. So, in case you feel you need a little more coverage here, I have a video that's 20 minutes long or so that is over in my CISSP Exam Cram collection, and it is quantitative risk analysis, just the formulas. This is the thumbnail. I'll put a link in the video description if you feel you need a bit more time with the formulas. That video in 20 minutes walks you through an example end-to-end using those formulas. I tell you at the end of every video, feel free to drop questions in the comments or ping me on LinkedIn. I'll tell you that ahead of time today. If you have questions on the formulas, if there's something that's just not quite clicking, leave me a comment and we'll talk about it. Okay, a couple of terms that show up on the syllabus you need to know. And these are two terms that refer to the possibility of a risk event occurring. So on the surface, they appear to be synonyms, and they are, but there's a subtle difference. So we have probability, which refers to the chance of an event happening. It's often expressed as a numerical value between 0, which is impossible, and 1, which is certain. So probability represents a quantitative approach, much like quantitative risk analysis. And then we have likelihood, which expresses the chance of a risk occurring using descriptive terms like high, medium, low, or rare. This represents a qualitative approach. Let's move on to the risk register. So the risk register is a tool we use in both risk management and project management. Now, sometimes it's used to fulfill regulatory compliance, but often it's just used to track potential issues that can derail intended outcomes. A risk register typically includes several details like the risk ID, description, probability, impact, severity, intended response, and the owner of that risk. The metrics in a risk register are going to vary from company to company. It should be considered a living document and updated periodically, at least annually. In a project, you're definitely going to be updating it more frequently than that, sometimes even weekly. And then we have the heat map. So a risk matrix is used to provide a visual representation of risks affecting a company. So the heat map shows the severity of the situation, with the most severe risks being in red. So you see the likelihood ranging from very unlikely to very likely as we go up, and the impact from left to right becoming more severe. So remember, likelihood is the qualitative version of probability, right? And you notice the risk matrix here, the heat map, it's using qualitative terms, low, medium, high, etc. Some key concepts associated with a risk register you should be familiar with for the exam. So we have key risk indicators, which are measurable metrics that signal potential changes in the likelihood or the impact of a risk. So monitoring KRIs allows for early detection, escalation, and mitigation. And we also have to think about risk owners. So each risk should be assigned a designated owner, typically a person or a department responsible for managing and mitigating the risk. If there's not a specified owner of the risk, nobody owns it, it's going to be sure to get ignored. So assigning that owner just ensures accountability for addressing the risk. Then we have the risk threshold, which refers to the level of risk tolerance established by the organization. The risk register may be qualitative, as was the one I showed you here, but it could also be quantitative using numeric scoring. Especially in project management, I find that the risk matrix, the heat map, is almost always qualitative because it's just human judgment as we go along. And we're estimating the severity and likelihood based on our past experience. Okay, now there's a phrase here at the tail end of risk matrix, risk tolerance. I want to talk to you about risk appetite and tolerance now. So risk appetite and risk tolerance are two terms often used interchangeably, but there's a difference. So Risk appetite describes the amount of risk an organization is willing to accept without mitigating. The organization uses its risk appetite to determine its risk threshold. The threshold is the level of risk a situation must rise to before the organization chooses to take action to manage that risk. Risk tolerance, on the other hand, refers to the organization's ability to take on risk. So, for example, an organization with more cash on hand has a greater ability to maintain stability through financial risk. It's important that an organization's appetite and tolerance are aligned, that the organization's willingness to accept risk is well matched to their ability to manage that risk, to weather that storm. So the syllabus mentions levels when it comes to risk appetite. So again, just to restate, risk appetite refers to the amount of risk an organization is willing to accept. And there are 3 levels of risk appetite. So organizations with expansionary risk appetites are willing to take on a high level of risk in pursuit of high rewards. Neutral risk appetites take a balanced approach to risk-taking, and conservative risk appetites prefer low-risk investments and prioritize preserving their current security posture. Appetite's going to vary by organization based on their goals and their strategic objectives, but generally speaking, startups and organizations investing in cutting-edge tech tend to have greater appetite for risk. Now let's talk risk management strategies, also called response to risk. So there's risk acceptance, where we do nothing. You just accept the risk and the potential loss that goes with it if the threat occurs. Or as we say, if the threat is realized. Risk mitigation. So you mitigate a risk by implementing a countermeasure and accepting the residual risk. Residual risk is the risk that remains, the amount of risk that remains once you have implemented your security control. So risk mitigation is the act of reducing risk. Then we have risk transference, where we transfer or assign risk to a third party, such as when we buy an insurance policy to protect against damage. Whether that's insurance on a physical structure or it's cyber insurance to help in the event of a cyber attack. And then there's risk avoidance, when the cost of mitigating or accepting the risk are higher than the benefits of the service. We just avoid the risk altogether. And this could mean not implementing a new service because we want to avoid a risk that we can't mitigate or accept. Now, there's a bit of nuance when it comes to risk acceptance we need to talk about. It's called out in the syllabus, and that's exception versus exemption. These are the 2 flavors of risk acceptance. So, exception is a temporary deviation from a security policy or control due to specific circumstances. It's a documented and approved decision to accept a higher level of risk for a defined period. Exemption, on the other hand, is a permanent deviation from a security policy or control. It's a formal decision to permanently accept a risk because mitigation is deemed impractical or infeasible. Then we move on to the reporting phase of risk assessment. The risk report will detail risks discovered and generally recommendations for remediation as well, and the organization's leadership uses this to decide which controls to implement and which risks they're willing to accept. The risk report contains sensitive information, so it should be restricted to those with need to know. Reporting is the last phase of the risk assessment process, and arguably the most critical phase because it's delivering actionable guidance to the organization's leadership, so they can then respond to that risk. Next, we have the business impact analysis, which identifies mission-critical functions and critical systems that are essential to the organization's success. It also identifies maximum downtime limits for these systems and components, as well as the scenarios that can impact these systems and the potential losses from an incident. And these inputs enable the organization to make some decisions around their critical infrastructure. So the organization has some decisions to weigh, and a business impact analysis contains two important items: a cost-benefit analysis and a calculation of the return on investment. The cost-benefit analysis lists the benefits of the decision alongside their corresponding costs. Now, that CBA can be strictly quantitative, adding the financial benefits and subtracting the cost to determine whether a decision will be profitable. A thorough cost-benefit analysis will also consider intangible benefits, those you cannot calculate directly. And there are a couple of key recovery metrics we settle on in the process of our business impact analysis. There's the recovery point objective, or RPO, which is the age of data that must be recovered from backup storage for normal operations to resume if a system or network goes down. Effectively, the max tolerable data loss between the last backup and the disaster. And then we have the recovery time objective, or RTO, which is the duration of time and a service level within which a business process must be restored after a disaster in order to avoid unacceptable consequences associated with that break in continuity. Generally, the SLAs between a company and its customers will heavily influence the RPO and RTO. And finally, we have a couple of business continuity related definitions that you should know for the exam. There's the MTBF, mean time between failures, which is a time determination for how long a piece of IT infrastructure will continue to work before it fails. And there is the mean time to repair, MTTR, which is a time determination for how long it will take to get a piece of hardware or software repaired and back online. Pretty straightforward definitions. And that brings us to the end of section 5.2. I hope you're getting value from the series. Our journey is nearing its conclusion. If you have any questions, as always, leave them in the comments below the video or reach out directly on LinkedIn. Happy to help anywhere I can. I'll look forward to seeing you back here in a day or so for section 5.3. And until next time, take care and stay safe.